Alright, game number 2 is on the way. This is between Terminator and Fantasy. This was, I believe, the first game of the set, and the first game of the entire round of 16 group as well. So, we're going to be taking a look at what happens when Fantasy doing the same. Yeah, this is first term. Wait. Yeah, this is first Terminator. The one before was first Super. He's literally doing the exact same thing, and he's in the exact same position. And this is the exact same map, and he's doing the exact same SCV scout as well. So that almost threw me off there because it looked like deja vu from the previous game. But this is going to be a game that ends a bit differently. It's going to be going on for a lot longer. We get to see more in-depth Ghost Viking battles and what actually happens when Terminator doesn't take too much damage from this, and in fact, when Fantasy actually is on the bad end of this aggression, which can happen. It's very hard to balance this three-pronged attack and stay on top of everything, so it's a very aggressive strategy, a very aggressive timing attack, and there's a lot of potential for both players to go wrong. So if you're into that nitty-gritty stuff and you want to like it's not gimmicky by any means. It's just very hard to stay on top of everything and kind of requires a bit of multitasking so that you can macro and you can set up this three-pronged attack at the same time. Anywho, this is basically the same build order that he did in the other game that we covered. And let me try to find something different that's going on. Literally the same thing, and I think his building placement's also very similar as well. For the Protoss player, he seems to be just going for a very standard Mothership Core expand. He delayed his Stalker a little bit, and that was to chrono out some extra probes. This is the first time that Terminator scouted. He sees that there's a fast command center, so you can assume that's a command center first because of the timing of the orbital and the amount of Marines that are out. So he's sending his Mothership Core out to either scout for a proxy or to go around the map and poke at the natural of Fantasy, although I'm confused why he's not doing it. He's not going the other way. I think because he saw the command center, he was able to just assume that it's not a Reaper expand, but he wasn't able to cross off the list if it was like a proxy factory play. So I think that's why he did that. Like it could have been like a 15 gas in a proxy factory because the probe didn't get very much information here. Terminator also going for the blink. He does something different though. I think he takes a fast third base. I don't 100% remember what he does, but it is a lot different. But the blink openings are the same, but it is still different. The robotics facility. And it's still going down at about the same time. The only difference between Terminator and Super's play is that Super had a second gateway, whereas Terminator only has one gateway, and he's going for Blink. A much greedier version, but also very acceptable because of the very fast command center that we saw from Fantasy. Super also saw a gas at the natural, and you can assume that it's going to be 3 gases. You cannot do that in TVZ, but in TvP you can assume that like there's not going to be 1 gas in the main and 1 in the natural unless you go for Reaper expand. That's the only way the gas timings line up that it can work like that. We see Fantasy's units are all in position. He has 14 Marines, so that's 6 Marines on each mineral line and then 2 Marines in the bunker. And he also has 2 Marauders. And then he, again, only makes the 2 Marauders. Then he makes the factory. He gets the stim, blah, 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 blah. But then he makes the 4 Marines so that he can get +1 attack before continuing production with those Marauders and bio units. On the production tab, we see Terminator's build differing very slightly, getting the double forges, getting 3 additional gateways up. I think Fantasy, if he was able to scout this or ID this, would have been able to do a pretty large stim timing attack. I believe stim would have been done before the Colossi would have popped out. If not, oh my gosh, let's take a look at that again. Look at that, 4 Marauders and 20 Marines against 3 Stalkers, 1 Sanctuary, and a Mothership Core. Fantasy is just skyrocketing in supply because of this opener. It's heavy emphasis on both economy and just sheer force of units. Again, his turret's coming down a little bit late for my eyes. I would prefer to see it before the 8-minute mark if you're really building it to stop DTs. Otherwise, I don't really know why you would build it. I guess like it's better to have it. It's just not at a very optimal time against DT rush. Like DTs could still hurt him pretty badly. We see that he's also at 50 SCVs again, and this is where he stops SCV production to add those 4th and 5th barracks and the command center. And also, he wasn't pushing out earlier on like he did versus Super, so he hasn't actually lost very many units. I think he's only lost a couple units to those Blink Stalkers. There are, of course, only 3 Stalkers out on the field. And so, see how it's 10 minutes and he's at 93 out of 100 supply, or 110. That's pretty close. I believe in a couple other, or at least in one other game that he does this build, he actually hits 100 supply at 10 minutes. Like that's pretty much the max that you'll be able to hit, or like your benchmark will be at. We see here though that double drop coming again for Fantasy, and he has that bio army up in the front. The only difference is between Super and Terminator's play is that Terminator has double forge and he hasn't taken a very fast third. He's played a very greedy tech route instead of playing a very greedy economic route, and as a result, this double pronged attack really isn't going to do too much damage over here. We know that Fantasy saw that Terminator has blink. There was a little skirmish over here, so he can't really be too aggressive with this build because Terminator isn't actually spreading himself very thin. He's only on 2 bases, and he can definitely defend both of these forces fairly easily. So it's kind of a mistake that Fantasy tries to drop these units. I mean, he didn't really try. He was just skirting along the edge. He purposefully was skirting along this area right here, just like staying on the edge. But his reaction to the Blink Stalkers was slow. You see there, he speed boosted after the Blink Stalkers got a shot off, and the Blink Stalkers are able to get a second shot off, killing that medevac. 10 supply worth of units down for free. This Bioforce trying to do some damage. Gets the refinery at the cost of 2 Marauder, or like a Marauder and 2 or 3 Marines. Not very great trading from Fantasy going down, and that's because Fantasy's trying to be aggressive against a Protoss player who isn't overextending himself. He doesn't have that fast third base, so his army can actually cover all of the areas that he needs to cover. As a result, like Fantasy lost that entire dropship worth of units for free. So one of his prongs of his attack that would go into the main normally now is only 1 medevac, and he just doesn't really have much left to do a multi-pronged attack. Like this was his time to be aggressive, his time to try to get some damage done, or to set up to try to contain the Protoss player. If he was able to keep that medevac alive, he still would have been able to do a good amount of damage. And to keep the units alive at the front as well. He lost a bunch of units there too. At least a production round that got picked off by the chasing Stalkers and the very angry Protoss army. But Fantasy ended up overextending, and he's trying to do these multi-pronged attacks. He really just wanted to get the Widow Mines down to try to get some good shots off and kill the cannon. That wasn't even very effective. Those Widow Mines did very little damage. He's trying to do another pronged attack over here. It gets to Nexus, which is good, but Fantasy is not in a great position this game compared to Super, because Super's upgrades are very, very far ahead of Fantasy's right now. He's at 1-1. He's almost at 2-2. Fantasy hasn't started 2-2 yet, and Super's 2-2 is like, it just needs like a quarter of the way done. So although Super hasn't started his third base yet, he's deflected Fantasy's aggression and he's traded enough of his Fantasy's army for Super's whatever, just like canceling the Nexus, lose a bunch of units, stuff like that. That Fantasy isn't really ahead this game. It might seem like he's ahead because he has a third base and Super doesn't, but Super's army is very, very powerful, and Fantasy's not going to be able to contest that for a very long time. His 2-2 just started now. He's gearing up to do some more multi-pronged attacks because he's recognized that Super's been very very passive with his play. And he also, pretty sure he did, if we would watch his first person view we would know, but pretty sure he clicked on the Protoss units and saw how fast these upgrades are, so he recognizes that Super is doing a double forge attack or a double forge tech path. And so like he knows that the best thing he can do now is just transition into Ghost Viking and build up the biggest, scariest army possible. And that there's no way his army isn't going to be nearly as cost efficient as it would like to be against a Protoss player with double upgrade advantage on you, soon to be like he's going to have a 2 upgrade advantage until Fantasy reaches 3-3. So there's not really much aggression that he can do right now. So this game, with the failed mid-game aggression, Fantasy wasn't able to get an advantage. However, it didn't cost him the game like it did in some of the other games that he played against Terminator and Super. So he's just transitioning into the Ghost Viking stage. He's going to secure 4th base, and it's business as usual, just macroing up and trying to get a very scary army composition against Supers. So next time we see the Unistab, yes! Alright, we see 36 Marines, 15 Marauders, 15 Vikings. 15 Vikings versus 5 Colossi. 5 Colossi is a lot. You kind of need closer to 20 Vikings so that you can one-shot the Colossi. 3 Ghosts, that's an okay amount. There's only 2 Sentries out. There are 16 Zealots. I believe they have Charge. Now, these Charge slots do have a big upgrade advantage, so they're going to be a lot more effective against the Bio. But as far as Storm Tech Archons, they are non-existent because of the heavy emphasis on the double upgrades by the Protoss player. So Fantasy's army looking pretty strong. He's also maxing out, so his army supply is going to be... He's going to have a little bit of an advantage with the army supply as well. The only thing he doesn't have an advantage in is his tech. He is so far behind in upgrades. It's not even worth trying to catch up. Now we see Fantasy hitting that 19 Viking count, about the 20 Vikings that he needs to be able to one-shot this Colossi. So far, he's taking his 4th base. He's a superior army composition. The only thing that isn't going for him is the upgrades. We see here this fight. It's going to unfold. Fantasy's looking to trade because he's up a base. He can trade cost efficiently. And what we see here is that very delicate dance between the two armies. You cannot do this in Terran versus Zerg because everything just dies so fast, but in TvP, everything heals up, shields heal up, bio heals up, so you can kind of afford to do this dance. Fantasy, he was able to get Colossi, he was able to get the Mothership Core, he lost a good amount of bio, now he has to get the hell out of there because he lost way too many bio units, and he's not going to be able to contest this ground army if he tries to fight over here. And we see him trying to fight over here, which is not that great. These Colossi, they're still getting decent shots off, even though they are dying and dropping like flies. And Fantasy's army, like, he's able to escape with a good amount of bio. I don't know how many Vikings he was able to escape with. I think he might have escaped with almost none. So he lost about 15... Yeah, he lost almost all of his Vikings. He lost at least 15 Vikings in that one fight, which is a very damn expensive amount of units because Vikings cost 150 minerals and 75 gas. So he definitely didn't take a good engagement compared to Super, or not Super, Terminator, the Protoss player. And that was to try to contest Terminator's 4th base, which Fantasy failed to do. So now they're on even base count. They both have pretty decent economies right now, except Fantasy took the worser trade in the previous engagement. So it's going to be up to him to take a really good engagement and just overwhelm the Protoss with one big engagement. Now, this multi-pronged harass by Terminator, very good. I like to see that. And that's what happens when you break down the rocks really fast, is you can send units straight into the natural for the rest of the game. And that's what we saw didn't happen to Super because he wasn't able to break down the rocks very fast. But this Terminator used his army advantage, and Fantasy was being forced to be in a defensive positioning. And so while he was doing that, Super used that opportunity to break down the rocks and to sack some units in. So now that he can remax on a different unit composition. He still has the 5 Colossi though, and Fantasy only has 10 Vikings. He is producing 4 at a time, but Vikings produce very slowly compared to Colossi. He has a good amount of bio at home, so this counterattack doesn't do way too much damage. You can't actually attack up into that. Even if you have a pretty big army advantage as a Protoss player, you can't attack into a small ramp like that. We saw those EMPs go off, hit everything. We saw the Vikings get some good shots off on the Colossi. The army's just being completely funneled into a small choke point. No bueno, no bueno. So that was a decent engage by Fantasy. Picked off a couple of units for a good price. There's no bunker at the third, which I absolutely hate. There's no reason why there should not be a bunker at the third base right here. I believe all these units are going to die. The Marines are not strong enough to kill that DT in the Zealot. The DT does way too much damage. Right now, Fantasy, he's in a dicey situation right now. What's happening right here is that Terminator's army is flanking Fantasy. Fantasy has no option to retreat right now. I don't even believe Fantasy's at 3-3 either, and Super's at 3-1-3. I think Fantasy's 3-3 may just be finishing up. But we see here at the units the units tab, 15 Vikings versus 6 Colossi. That's not going to cut it. I'm sorry, Fantasy. And that Bioforce isn't nearly big enough. Like, if all of the Colossi were neutralized for very little loss, then this Bioforce would be able to stand a chance, maybe even run away, trade cost efficiently. Like, if not being able to run away, then trade so that a counterattack wouldn't immediately kill him. But some EMPs go off on the Stalkers. Not the best engagement. These Colossi, they're not dying fast enough is what the problem is. And they're getting very, very good shots off on the bio units. And although the force kind of gets cleaned up, Terminator is able to, that Warping of Zealots saves his life and really turns the tide of battle into a much more promising victory for Terminator than it does for Fantasy at the very end. Because Fantasy just ran out of units. The Colossi did way too much damage, and they weren't neutralized fast enough in that fight. Fantasy also was just he was also blocked as well. There was no leaving. Like that army was suicided basically as soon as Terminator decided to position his army like that and cut Fantasy off. So taking a very good engagement there was Terminator, and now we see Fantasy's in an awful position. This harass has done a lot of damage to his economy. He's still on 4 bases. This constant harass though is going to prevent him from expanding to a 5th base, like having the money to do that, and just like barely staying on a 4 base economy, which at this point is now about 2 base, 1.5 depending on how many mules were used. Fantasy though was able to take out Super's oh no, that's Terminator. I'm getting these guys mixed up so hard. Terminator's 5th base was able to be taken out, but Terminator is up a freaking base now, and there's just this is where things start to go downhill because Fantasy took that one bad engagement and he wasn't ahead economically, and as a result the Protoss player was able to replenish his army a lot faster. Now Fantasy's on the defense. There's not really much he can do except hope that Terminator messes up, because at this point it's Terminator's game to throw. We see 12 Vikings already made versus the 3 Colossi. The 3rd Colossi just popped out, so it's good for it's a good unit comp for Fantasy. Oh my god. Terminator has a lot of Zealots and a lot of Stalkers though. Very heavy gateway army. And the upgrades are neutralized this time. The reason why Terminator remaxed on a gateway army was because he knew that he would be able to remax faster, and as a result, even though his army composition is technically inferior to Fantasy's, Fantasy just doesn't have enough bio units to actually win the engagement here. because he wasn't maxed out. And so, with the help of Protoss Warpin, this battle goes the wrong way very fast. There's just not enough bioforces to clean up the gateway units. The gateway units still dealt enough DPS to take another good engagement by Super. Or, oh my god. I even heard it coming out of my mouth and I knew it was wrong. By Terminator. Terminator actually wanted to gain an engagement like that because he is up a base versus Fantasy. Fantasy's also lost the majority of his SCVs. He's down 20 workers already. And although the army is even-ish right now, it's not going to be for very long because Super is on 5 bases, like I said a million times. He's also producing 2 Colossi at a time. That's 12 supply every, I think, like minute or 80 to 90 seconds. Which is a very massive amount. His supply is going to spike up very soon. Also with the additional warp-in round of units. And now we see Super again. Oh my god. Terminator again maxing out with mostly a gateway army. He still hasn't built any High Templar yet, or Archons. Because he simply doesn't need to. He's instead using all of his resources instead of teching to a different thing to just kind of remax on this gateway heavy army and trade versus Fantasy's much smaller bio count. Is that, yeah, that is 32 Zealots versus 12 Marauders and 27 Marines. 32 Zealots might not seem very great, like why make that many, but as we see here, there's just not enough Bioforce to clean up these Zealots or the rest of the gateway units. And now the supplies have shifted, Fantasy's on his last legs, and GG is gonna have to be called. So this was pretty much Terminator in the past, I think it's like 10 to 15 minutes after he secured that third base, and it's really after he took that one good engagement. He had an econ advantage, and he just remaxed faster than Fantasy because of that. And just these mass zealots. Who needs Storm when you have mass zealots and you don't have enough bio to kill that? So that was an example of how a game went kind of poorly. The multi-pronged attacks didn't work. He overextended with that. He didn't win Ghost Viking engagements, and as a result, he started falling way behind. He couldn't remax his army, and Terminator just did a very safe move, remaxing with mostly gateway units, very cheap units to throw away, just to trade the armies, because Fantasy wouldn't be able to replenish nearly as fast as Terminator would for his army. So that's kind of a video on why Fantasy loses and what went wrong and what to look out for when you lose. Like it'll be a good video to watch to figure out why you lost. And that's why I wanted to do it. And so yeah, it pretty much brings an end to this little I guess episode, because it's 2 videos, so it's not this video. Whatever the technical term is. I will make a organized post so that you guys will have access to the build order, and definitely try it out online. Let me know how it goes in your ladder games. If you guys have any questions, if I missed anything as well, I'll be able to answer that too. So I will see you guys all later, and peace out. Thanks for watching.